My name is Dawn Crum, and I am in the External Relations Office here in the School of Education. And I have the pleasure to introduce Ken Zeichner to you today. He's a very familiar face to the School of Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. After 35 years here at UW-Madison, excuse me, Ken Zeichner retired. He did it in July, and he joined the faculty of the University of Washington. We're okay with the W's, Washington.
All right. I'll explain the purple in a minute.
While at UW, he spent 9 years as an Associate Dean for Teacher Education and International Education, as the Hofs-Bascom Professor of Teacher Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. His work included initiating school-university partnerships in teacher education with the Madison Public Schools and directing an international student teaching experience that enables students to complete 10 to 20 weeks of their student teaching in a public school in another country. Ken's research has examined different aspects of teacher education in the U.S. and beyond. For many years, he's focused on understanding the historical trajectories of different approaches to improving teacher education and on elaborating the underlying assumptions, program elements, and consequences of different approaches to social justice-oriented teacher education. He worked on teacher education initiatives in many parts of the world, most notably Namibia, from 1994 to 2004. And he's hoping to begin a new program soon that provides professional development to university teacher educators in Ethiopia and studies its impact on the teacher education programs in their universities. So please join me in welcoming Ken Zeichner.
Is the mic, can you hear me? Okay. Good morning. It's really great to be back in Madison and in the School of Education where I pretty much spent my whole professional career. I started here as a young 29-year-old freshly minted PhD in the late 1970s and spent many wonderful years here in the School of Education until I moved to Seattle and the University of Washington, Seattle 2 years ago. I always knew Madison and the University of Wisconsin-Madison are special places. And I always knew this when I was here, and I know it even more now that I've been away for 2 years. Sometimes my new colleagues in Seattle mistaken my frequent purple attire, and I am wearing purple today, as a love for husky purple, but they are wrong. Last summer, when I was packing away some things in my attic in our Madison house to take back to Seattle, I came across a purple award that was given to me in the 1980s by some of my students here. My love for the Badgers is still strong, and I'll continue to wear purple, but still love the Badgers at the same time. All right, my talk this morning is concerned with issues that have been near and dear to me throughout my career at UW-Madison, teaching and teacher education. Currently, there's an intense debate that's taking place in many parts of the world about the kind of teaching and teacher education that should define education in the 21st century. In the brief time that I have today, I will outline the main ideas at issue in these debates and offer my analysis of how I think we should seek to resolve them, and the jurisdictional challenge that colleges and universities are now facing to their right to offer teacher education programs. Okay. There we go. The debates I will describe are concerned with some of the most basic questions about teaching and teacher education, such as the nature of the teaching role for which we are preparing teachers. Who should prepare them? When should the preparation take place, and what should be the content of the preparation program curriculum? Historically, the central issues underlying debates about the best approaches to teacher education stem from different assumptions about the purposes of public education, teaching in the learning process, and the teacher's role. In the current debates, two different visions of the role of teachers and teacher preparation are being advocated. On the one hand, some have proposed building or maintaining a professional teaching force to serve all students, and a system of teacher education that prepares teachers for professional roles and teaching careers. Others have argued that it is too costly to build and maintain a professional teaching force to teach everyone's children, and have advocated for preparing teachers of other people's children as technicians to implement teaching scripts which they are provided, in the belief that this preparation that they receive and the subsequent scripting of instruction will lead to improvements in pupils' standardized test scores. Initial teacher education, in this view, usually referred to as teacher training, should be very brief, take place on the job. There's very little expectation that these teachers will have teaching careers, and the system would be designed to make it possible for these temporary teachers to be replaced in a few years by other narrowly trained teachers who will also leave in a few years. While these same debates are going on all over the world right now, I'm going to focus today on how they're being enacted and played out in the United States, which has a teaching force of about 3.6 million who teach in about 90,000 schools, and approximately 1,400 colleges and universities are authorized to offer teacher education programs in the United States. And increasingly, a variety of other nonprofit and for-profit programs are running programs that currently prepare about a third of the teaching force in the United States. Now, for most of the formal history of teacher education in the United States, a variety of pathways have existed into teaching, both inside and outside colleges and universities. At one time or another since the mid-19th century, when formal teacher education began, a variety of institutions, secondary schools, seminaries, academies, normal schools, teacher institutes, teachers' colleges, community colleges, and colleges and universities have all played important parts in educating the nation's teachers. Throughout the nation's history, most teachers have actually entered teaching through what might now be called alternative routes, including substantial number of teachers who were prepared in school district-based teacher education programs. My wife's high school in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, girls' high school, was originally a normal school, as an example, and that was true all over the country. It was only for a relatively brief period of time, 1960 to 1990, that colleges and universities held a virtual monopoly in teacher education. Since the 1990s, there has been a tremendous increase in non-college and university-sponsored programs, including new for-profit programs. And more individuals are entering the teaching force in the United States through non-university-sponsored routes into teaching, sometimes with little or no preparation at all before they assume full responsibility for classrooms of students. Despite the growth in these non-university programs, most teachers in the U.S. still enter teaching through 4-year or 5-year undergraduate or 1-year, 2-year post-baccalaureate university programs. It is estimated between 70 and 80% teachers still come through university routes. In some parts of the country, though, nearly as many teachers enter the field through non-college and university programs as through university ones. And in at least one state, Florida, school districts are required to have their own teacher education programs. There's widespread agreement in the United States and in some parts of the world that existing institutions of teacher education that emphasize what has been referred to as brick-and-mortar, campus-based initial teacher education are inadequate for meeting the demand to prepare new teachers for urban or remote rural classrooms, and that new models of teacher education are also needed that distribute teacher education over time rather than all before the commencement of teaching. Globally, there are about 54 million teachers, and just to meet the quantitative aspects of the demand to meet universal primary education, many millions of teachers are needed. And these millions, which we haven't achieved, and the goal is 2015 for achieving universal primary education, those quantitative projections don't even begin to address the issue of teacher quality and the need to prepare teachers to teach students with special needs and in remote schools. In preparing teachers to meet the demands to achieve universal primary education, there's a clear tension between creating high-quality teacher education for a small number of candidates and opening access to large numbers of candidates without being adequately able to prepare and support them. Now, currently, as you all probably know, in the United States, as in many other countries, there are serious gaps in opportunities to learn, school completion rates, academic achievement for different segments of the population. For example, in addition to the growing inequalities in access to resources and environments that help people live their lives with dignity, there continues to be a crisis of inequality in U.S. public schools that denied many children living in poverty and children of color a high-quality education, despite the good work of dedicated and talented teachers. A number of gaps in educational opportunities and outcomes have persisted despite all the reforms that have taken place in schools. These inequalities in achievement include inequalities in achievement as measured by standardized tests in reading and math, in secondary school graduation rates, in increased segregation of students according to race, ethnicity, and social class background, in inequitable public funding for schools in different areas, in unequal access to advanced courses that provide the gateway into college, in unequal access to a broad and rich curriculum that educates students to understand and think critically, and the disproportionate assignment of students of color and English learners to special education classes that offer limited educational opportunities. These inequities have served to widen the gaps between which students learn to be thinkers and authentic problem solvers and those who are forced to learn out of context and to interact with knowledge in artificial ways. There is also, as in much of the world, an inequitable distribution of fully qualified teachers. Currently, we have a situation in the United States where there are serious inequities between the kind of teacher education that is provided for teachers who work in different communities. Most of the teachers who enter the teaching force through one of the fast track or early entry programs where most of the preparation occurs while novice teachers are fully responsible for classrooms, teach in poor urban and rural communities of color. These early entry teachers are not found teaching students from the middle and upper classes. They're not found teaching the students of the advocates of deregulation, the children of those advocates of deregulation. Although the research on the effects of different pathways into teaching is not conclusive, there is some evidence of a learning loss by pupils as underprepared teachers of record are catching up with teachers who have completed a full preparation before starting to teach. And it's pretty clear that because of the high turnover in most many poverty-impacted schools, certain communities become dependent on a constant supply of early entry teachers who stay for a few years and leave. The current system does not help these communities to develop the capacity to have a more experienced teaching staff in its schools and to lessen the dependence on inexperienced and underprepared teachers. Given the documented importance of teaching experience and teacher quality, there's a serious problem of injustice for some poor communities. My college partners with Teach for America. There are only 10 Teach for America teachers in Seattle and Federal Way because of the opposition in the community. It was recently said to me by somebody associated with the program that my university runs for these Teach for America teachers that in 3 years, 9 of the 10 should be good teachers. But, you know, all 10 of them are struggling terribly right now. Okay, I'm raising issues about whose children are these people teaching and who are they not teaching. Because of the existence of some studies that have shown a low correlation between teacher experience and degrees and student test scores, some critics have made an absolute claim that neither an experience nor schooling beyond a bachelor's degree make any difference in teacher effectiveness. Mike Rose of UCLA has criticized these claims that experience and further study by teachers are not related to teaching effectiveness based on the limited nature of the studies. And I want to quote a little of what he says. On the face of it, says Rose, this is a remarkable assertion. Can you think of any other profession from hairstyling to firefighting to neurosurgery where we wouldn't value experience and training? The problem is that the studies, for the most part, deal in simple aggregates and define experience and in training in crude ways. Experience is defined as years on the job. And there's no surprise that years alone don't mean much. What people do with their time on the job is critical and becomes the foundation of expertise. As for the question of post-baccalaureate work, the same principle applies. What kind of training, where, what curriculum, what kind of supervision? To discount experience and training in a blanket fashion is not only wrong-headed, Rowles says, but undercuts attempts to create better working conditions for teachers, more robust professional development, and opportunities for career advancement. There have been two major responses by the federal government to teacher education over the years. The first response has been efforts to build an effective system of teacher education by injecting targeted resources into the college and university system to promote innovation. And there's a whole history of this work over the years. Some of my early grants when I started as a faculty member here were through the Department of Education. The Teacher Quality Partnership Grants, which is a current example, so they haven't all disappeared yet. The federal government also for a time was investing in building research capacity in teacher education. There were two centers at University of Texas at Austin and Michigan State, both of which I had some connection to over the years where there was an investment in research. Much of that has largely disappeared. And the private foundations, several of them, particularly Carnegie and Ford, have over the years invested in innovation in college and university teacher ed. I went through a Ford Foundation urban teacher preparation program in the late 1960s. And I went into an institution 2 years ago that was part of the Teachers for a New Era project, which was a $100 million investment in improving university and college teacher education. Much of this has disappeared now from the foundation world. The current and second response has involved efforts by the Federal Department of Education to greatly reduce or dismantle the college and university system of teacher education in the United States, in part because of a wide perception of the unwillingness of colleges and universities to improve. There's been a shift away from investing in improvement and efforts to break up the system and to try to replace it with market competition. Arthur Levine, a former education school dean and now president of a foundation that is involved with education, has argued the private sector sees teacher education and professional development as low cost and a high volume field with the potential for significant profit. Higher education is viewed as high in price, low in technology use, inefficient, and weak in leadership. These perceived weaknesses make it a superb investment prospect. This deregulation of teacher education and the belief that creating a competitive market for the preparation of teachers will lead to the greatest quality is also occurring in other countries, often promoted by governments or by development agencies such as the World Bank. Now, consistent with the national fervor in the United States to criticize university ed schools as obstacles to real reform, and to talk about university teacher education programs as barriers to the entry to teaching, both the Bush and Obama administrations and several influential private foundations have promoted the deregulation of teacher education and the growth of non-university providers. One clear example of this is the Innovation in Education competition sponsored in 2010 by the department, in which $263 million were awarded on a competitive basis to promote innovation across different dimensions of education. The only teacher ed projects that were funded in this competition were two of the major non-university providers, Teach for America, $50 million, the New Teacher Project, $20 million, and the Boston Teacher Residency, which is situated in a community partner, $4.9 million. None of the projects that were submitted by college and university teacher educators were funded, including a major 23-state effort, which you are part of, to develop a rigorous performance assessment for initial teacher licensure. Another example is the Race to the Top competition recently sponsored by the Department of Education that provided a record amount of funding for school reform. One of the criteria in evaluating the applications was whether states had legislation in place that allowed non-university providers to operate within their borders. Washington did not when I got there, and it all changed last year, and now the state is being flooded by non-university providers. These examples, I would argue, demonstrate the ironic stance of the Obama administration in promoting lower standards for teacher education and entry to teaching, while at the same time advocating for higher standards in K-12 education. Currently, college and university teacher education is not seen as worthy of investment by either the federal government or many private foundations, and both are pouring money into alternative pathways. Major conferences and the national media have been flooded with speeches and papers that wonder if a college and university system of teacher education was a good idea. Arthur Levine has claimed that there's a growing sense among critics that it would be more fruitful to replace the university-based system of teacher education rather than to reform it. Confirmation of the low regard for university teacher education by policymakers and the mainstream media can be found in the current situation where national rankings of university teacher ed programs will be conducted beginning in 2012 by U.S. News and World Report, working in partnership with the National Council on Teacher Quality, an advocacy group historically biased against university teacher education, whose president has gone on record favoring the elimination of state teacher licensing. The lack of investment in college and university teacher education has many serious consequences. And ironically, it has deepened the inability to innovate in the very programs that are in need of reform. The local media all over the country have taken up in an uncritical way this narrative about the failure of university teacher education that is being promoted by groups like Democrats for Education Reform and the New Schools Venture Fund, which are essentially dictating or forming policies in teacher education for the Obama administration. For example, on October 7th, the Seattle Times lead editorial, refocusing the teacher quality debate, praised the main elements in Duncan's plan for teacher education that requires value-added evaluation of teacher education institutions according to the test scores of the pupils taught by the graduates of institutions. And then they reprinted word for word the following comment made by a teacher educator in an online forum. This quote was probably taken from Ticket to Teach, which is a white paper written by Democrats for Education Reform that became the basis for the legislation now on its way through Congress that would authorize charter, teacher, and principal preparation programs. And here's the quote that was in the Seattle Times in the lead editorial. A growing chorus of critics, including prominent education professors, are amplifying concerns about the weaknesses in teacher prep programs. The director of teacher education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, so there it must be true if it's coming out of Harvard, was quoted on a New York Times online forum as saying that of the nation's 1,300 graduate training programs, only about 100 were doing a competent job, and the rest could be shut down tomorrow. This type of derogatory depiction of university teacher education programs has been repeated over and over again in the local newspapers and around the country. It does not matter that there are not 1,300 graduate teacher education programs, or that Duncan's assertion in his blueprint that 50% of teacher candidates do not receive supervised clinical experience. It's impossible. It does not seem, it seems that people can say whatever they want or call something whatever they want, stand for children, and their assertions are taken at face value. If the National Council on Teacher Quality issues a report on teacher education, and they've been issuing them, it is covered by the New York Times and other major media outlets as if these reports have been vetted through an independent peer review process. It does not seem to matter that they have not been peer-reviewed by anyone. Along with the lack of investment by the federal government and foundations and the increased regulation of teacher education programs by states, which further undermines the ability to innovate in college and university programs, most states continue to substantially reduce their level of financial support to public universities, as you're very familiar with here, where most of the nation's teachers are still prepared in those public universities. Since 2009, when I went to the University of Washington, 50% of the state support for the University of Washington has disappeared. And if the proposed cuts that we have to make during this year, not waiting for next year, more cuts during this year, 2/3 of the state support will have evaporated. The lack of access to federal government and private foundation money, the continued deep cuts in state support for public universities have made it extremely difficult for university-based teacher education programs to operate, let alone innovate. Additionally, new punitive forms of accountability that have been brought into teacher education, even though they have been questioned by many of the leading experts in assessment. The most controversial, I alluded to a few minutes ago, is the major element in Duncan's plan for teacher education accountability, called Our Future, Our Teachers, is to evaluate and rank teacher education programs in universities based on the standardized test scores of pupils taught by the graduates from different university programs. This is the equivalent of the evaluation of medical schools according to how many patients are cured by doctors who graduated from different medical schools. Or at another level, holding business schools accountable for the terrible state of the US economy. Or holding medical schools accountable for the undisputed problems in our healthcare system. All of the cautions that have been raised by assessment experts about using test scores to evaluate teacher quality. That's one level. But then there are many additional problems raised by trying to use this same method to link student test scores to teachers and then back to their teacher prep programs have been ignored by policymakers. Suddenly, Louisiana and Tennessee, two of the states with the worst public performance records in the nation in the public schools, have become exemplars for reforming teacher education accountability. Business schools could also be held accountable for the number of new jobs created by their graduates from the individual business schools. There are a number of more reasonable ways other than value-added rankings of programs to strengthen, and it does need to be strengthened, the accountability system in teacher education, including more rigorous and mandatory national accreditation of programs, the development of high-quality teacher performance assessment that includes a student learning component, which is a pilot in 23 states right now, and higher standards on teacher licensing exams. While it is true that professional accountability through the profession itself, accreditation, bureaucratic accountability through the state regulation of programs, have failed to close down many weak programs, the solution to this situation, in my view, and in the view of the recent National Research Council panel on teacher education, is to study and redesign the system, not to destroy it. Support for non-university providers of teacher ed continues to increase, and both nonprofit and for-profit providers of teacher ed, including the New York Times and the Museum of Natural History in New York City, have opened up many new programs across the country. The dominant view, again, is that the U.S. needs to reduce the role of universities in teacher preparation and move towards shorter, more practical, and more clinically based programs. It's argued that bringing a wider range of expertise and competition into the preparation of teachers will raise the overall quality of teacher ed programs. Despite these noble proclamations, there is a lot of money to be made by private investors if teacher education in the U.S. is transformed into primarily a market economy. Some of the newer non-university programs, like Texas Teachers, advertise themselves as providing fast, affordable, and easy access to the teaching profession, while other non-university programs do provide alternative programs of substantive preparation. One of the scary things to me is how the university programs are starting to mimic the fast and easy access. There was recently National Louis University offered a Groupon coupon that you could get a discount for the first course in the teacher education program. One of the more recent aspects of this movement is to privatize what has largely been a public teacher education system, is an effort to open charter education programs, principal and teacher preparation. Relay Graduate School of Education that began in New York to prepare teachers for charter schools is an example. And in return, for what they claim are higher standards, and they argue that you can't leave the program until you show that you can raise student test scores. That's a complicated issue there. These programs want to be exempted from state regulations, or most state regulations. So a bill is in Congress. It's likely to pass. It's supported by both Democrats and Republicans. And what will happen is that these programs will be authorized, and they're going to go around the country in another race to the top type of competition and say, here's all this money. You can have some of it if you let these things happen, like charter teacher and principal preparation programs. And it's not surprising that the New Schools Venture Fund, a nonprofit that invests money in education given by individual and institutional investors, has provided a very strong lobbying effort on behalf of this bill. Rick Hess at the American Enterprise Institute, who's one of the new experts in teacher education in this era, has articulated a view shared by many when he proposed decoupling teacher education from universities. I just want to read a little bit of what he says. A shift from the assumption that teacher preparation and training should necessarily be driven by institutions of higher education to a more variegated model that relies on specialized providers, customized preparation for particular duties, and a just-in-time mindset regarding skill development and acquisition. He advocates abandoning the default role for colleges and universities, that this creates new opportunities, rather than struggle to connect college-based programs with site-based mentors or to boost the quality of student teaching. New models might provide new providers or district-based operations to host training in a more client-friendly locale and to import academic expertise and as they deem useful. So basically, we have these two forms of teacher ed, the college recommending or university recommending program where you complete the preparation before you're fully responsible for a classroom. And then the early entry program where you're doing much of the preparation or all of it while you are responsible for a classroom. Now, the encouragement of alternatives to university hegemony over teacher education is not a bad thing, necessarily. There's a range of quality in both early entry and college and university programs, and the introduction of good alternative programs can potentially stimulate innovation and improve all types of programs. What is important to note, however, that many of these early entry programs are often closely linked with a mostly technical view of the role of teachers, and with efforts to erode teachers' autonomy and collegial authority. Contrary to the many recommendations internationally to recognize teaching as complex and demanding intellectual work involving specialized knowledge and skills, the McKinsey report, as an example, the focus in some of the new programs is on preparing teachers to serve primarily as educational clerks or functionaries who implement scripted teaching strategies and curriculum, rather than preparing teachers as professionals who, in addition to their technical expertise, have also acquired adaptive expertise so that they are able to exercise their discretion and judgment in the classroom to adjust their teaching to meet the needs of their students. This trend in preparing teachers as only technicians and to minimize the financial cost of their preparation can also be seen in other countries, such as the widespread use of para-teachers in India, or what's been referred to as plasma teachers in Ethiopia, or the growing emphasis on teachers as implementers of tightly structured teaching scripts in many other countries. It is important to point out that the difference between view of teachers as professionals and as technicians is not whether teachers are taught to use a particular set of teaching skills based on research or professional consensus. Both a teacher as a technician orientation and a teacher as professional orientation should provide teachers with the tools and skills they need to be effective in supporting student learning. The difference between these two views is that the teacher as professional view goes beyond providing teachers with teaching and management skills, the 49 strategies in Doug Lamoff's book is an example, and also seeks to ensure that teachers have extensive knowledge of the social and political context in which they work, including the ways to access the funds of knowledge in the communities in which their students live, and of the many elements connected to teaching, such as assessment, pedagogy, curriculum, learning, development, how language is acquired. A professional preparation for teachers also seeks to help teachers learn how to exercise their judgment and adapt their practice, to learn how to learn in and from their practice so that they can continue to become better teachers throughout their careers and be active participants in school reform. Although, as I pointed out, alternative pathways have been part of teacher education in the United States since the beginning. And research on different models does support the need for different pathways to provide access to teaching for individuals at different stages of their lives and in different circumstances. And as I said, there's a clear range in quality in both traditional and alternative programs. I'm not arguing against alternatives or innovation. What I am arguing against is the current effort to replace college and university preparation with an early entry model, and with the danger in which I see the idea of teaching as a profession or a career in this country. Research has begun to provide a clear understanding of the characteristics of effective teacher ed programs, such as the presence of a clear and common vision of good teaching and learning that permeates all coursework and field experience. And in my view, the goal should be to support strong teacher ed programs and to improve or close down weak ones, whoever sponsors them. Now here's the arguments that I have for what's wrong with disinvesting in university teacher ed. The first issue is a question of capacity. Despite the exponential growth of alternative pathways in teaching since the 1980s, colleges and universities, as I said before, continue to prepare between 70 and 80% of teachers in the US. It is doubtful, given a teaching force of about 3.6 million, that an alternative system can be developed by advocates of greater competition in markets in teacher education that would not include significant involvement of colleges and universities. Second, there's also a legitimate question that should be raised about the capacity of already resource-strapped school districts to handle the increased responsibilities of a more school-based system of teacher ed without the infusion of additional funding and resources. Shifting teacher ed to be more school-based without building the capacity in schools for handling their increased role in initial teacher preparation will result in a situation like has occurred in the UK, where the schools were basically overwhelmed. Shift to the schools, and there were very few resources. Following the pattern in countries that lead the world today in student educational performance, we like to look at all these rankings internationally. Following what they do, preserving and strengthening the role of colleges and universities and the preparation of a professional teaching force and career teachers is critical. Colleges and universities can potentially make an important contribution to the education of teachers. And I went through some of those things that I thought that we offer a few minutes ago. And that the solution to there are problems in the college and university system that we need to deal with and that we have not dealt with. But again, the problem is to redesign and strengthen the system, not to abandon it. No country in the world today that has been successful in international comparisons of student achievement has achieved its success by relying heavily on a market-based economy in teacher education. And in fact, the countries that we continually point to as models, Finland, Singapore, South Korea, all have relied primarily upon a strong university teacher preparation system. Despite the success of some charter schools, the overall poor track record of privatization and the spread of charter schools at the K-12 level does not bode well for similar efforts now underway to deregulate teacher education in the United States. Finally, underlying much of the movement to privatize public schooling and teacher education is a belief that schools are broken, that the major cause of the problem of inequities in schooling is bad teachers and bad teacher education programs. If only we could fire the bad teachers and shut down the bad programs, then everything will be fine. This narrative ignores the overwhelming evidence that links inequities in schooling to the inequities in the broader society, such as the inequitable access to housing, nutritious food, jobs that pay a living wage, health care, early childhood care, and so on. Despite a clear need to improve university teacher education, these programs are about as responsible for the crisis in US public education as business schools are for the economy in the United States. Pedro Nogueira recently, in fact in the current issue of Kaplan, challenged the wisdom of policies that assert the opportunity and opportunity and learning gaps for students living in poverty can be eliminated by school intervention alone. And Pedro says, and I quote, "It has become fashionable for policymakers and reformers to criticize anyone who points to poverty as an obstacle to learning and higher achievement. Loudly proclaiming no excuses, these reformers proclaim that large numbers of ineffective teachers, not poverty, are the real obstacles to improving educational outcomes for poor children. While it's absolutely the case that poor children need dedicated, passionate, effective teachers and principals to be successful, there's no evidence that even the best schools can overcome the effects of poverty on their own." Despite the problems that have existed in university teacher ed and the improvements, we have made improvements over the years that a lot of people want to deny. There is a growing movement right now in college and university-based teacher education in the United States to respond to some of these long lasting problems, to move pre-service preparation closer to practice, to conduct some of the instruction of new teachers, methods courses, as we do in Seattle, in the settings for which students are being prepared to teach, to strengthen the clinical component in teacher education by investing in building the capacity of schools to serve as clinical sites for teacher preparation and the capacity of teachers to serve as effective mentors. There are a growing number of examples of new, more connected school-based forms of college and university teacher education where the responsibility for teacher preparation is shared across schools, universities, and communities. There has also been a growth in hybrid programs such as the urban teacher residencies that involve a school-based model, but in some of them the universities are partners and some of them they're not. But there is this effort by a lot of universities to try to become more relevant, more connected to the realities for which they're preparing people. The image of university teacher education that's often painted in the general media just does not exist at many places anymore. Professors just sitting in their offices. There's a lot of teacher education. I was just last week out at one of our partner schools with Sheila Valencia, one of our literacy faculty, co-teaching a methods course in one of our partner schools and accessing the expertise in very strategic ways that these teachers have, and the students were getting to try things out as they were seeing the professor demonstrate or the teacher try it out, get feedback, and a very intensive kind of clinical focus that's happening all over the country. And we know a lot from existing research about the kinds of investments that should be made to provide this kind of experience for all novice teachers, such as the careful selection of clinical placements, the preparation and ongoing support for the mentors that serve important roles in teacher ed programs that have been paid less per hour than you can make at McDonald's for all the work that they do. And the development of more rigorous evaluation of the success of these efforts in the practices of teacher candidates. So the idea of a rigorous performance assessment, that we need to look at how people actually can teach when they finish the programs. What I'm objecting to is this 3 years out kind of looking at it. And we just had a study done in Washington by Dan Goldhaber, one of the economists doing these studies. And it didn't provide any useful information to us that could help us improve our programs. You know, we came out near the top on all the rankings, but so what? I mean, what did it mean? We do the teacher performance assessment, and we've done it for a couple of years now. We get very detailed data about the performance of our candidates at the end of their program in relationship to all the state standards, including the cultural competency standards. And we get a lot of useful information out of those performance assessments that feed right back into the program to help improve it on an ongoing basis. Currently, we have a situation, and I'll conclude now, where there are serious inequities between the kind of teacher education that's provided for teachers who work in different communities. As I mentioned earlier, most of the teachers who enter the teaching force through the fast track or early entry programs, where most of the preparation occurs while the novices are fully responsible for a classroom, these teachers teach in poor urban and rural communities. These underprepared teachers who complete most of their preparation for teaching while serving as teachers of record are not found teaching students from the middle and upper middle classes. Addressing the serious inequities in educational opportunities and outcomes that continue to plague our public schools will require a significant investment in redesigning the college and university system of teacher education in the United States, so that it becomes more clinically based and more focused on the specific context for which teachers are being prepared. This new system must more effectively integrate college and university faculty and staff expertise with the expertise of the knowledge that exists in successful schools and in the communities the people who actually send their children to these schools. And the community-based educators who work with the same children in an out-of-classroom setting. To prepare the professional career teachers that everyone's children deserve to be taught by. There's no reason to believe from the poor performance of deregulation in markets and other sectors of the society from the experience of other countries with strong records of student achievement in their public schools that the current trend to dismantle college and university-based teacher education will result in anything positive for the nation. Continuing on this path, in my view, will only serve to widen the inequities in public education that now exist between different segments of the population. Thank you.